Let me start with something most people never say out loud. Some people do not leave because they stopped caring. They leave because staying started to feel like disappearing. There are people who walk away quietly, no explanation, no argument, no dramatic goodbye, just absence. And to the outside world, it looks cold, it looks cruel, it looks selfish. But what most people never consider is this. Some people were taught, long before they ever fell in love or formed deep bonds, that being present meant being erased, that being honest meant being unsafe, that being vulnerable meant being punished, that staying meant shrinking. So when they leave without closure, they are not trying to hurt anyone, they are trying to breathe again. This is the psychology of people who disappear without an explanation. Not because they lack empathy, not because they lack attachment, not because they lack depth, but because somewhere along the way, their nervous system learned that connection was something you survive, not something you rest inside. Most people think closure is something you give, but for people who leave quietly, closure is something they never received. They grew up in environments where emotions were inconvenient, where conflict was dangerous, where needs were ignored, where expressing pain only made things worse. So they learned a different language of survival. They learned silence. They learned distance. They learned how to leave before they were abandoned. They learned how to disappear before they were rejected. And eventually, leaving became the only way they knew how to protect themselves. People who walk away without closure are not emotionally careless. They are emotionally exhausted. They are people who stayed too long in situations that slowly taught their nervous system that connection equals danger. They are people who learned to carry the emotional weight of rooms they did not create. They are people who learned to read tension before it had words. They are people who learned to regulate other people's moods before learning how to feel safe in their own. They are people who learned that being needed was safer than being loved. And over time, something quiet and painful happens inside them. They begin to associate closeness with pressure, attachment with obligation, love with responsibility. So when they finally leave, it is not impulsive. It is the end of a very long internal battle. A battle between the part of them that wants connection and the part of them that knows what connection has cost them before. Most people imagine that disappearing takes courage. In reality, it usually comes from reaching emotional collapse. There is a moment for many of these people when they realize they have been performing themselves for too long, when they realize they have been managing everyone else's comfort at the expense of their own stability, when they realize they no longer recognize who they are inside the relationship. And that moment is terrifying, because for someone who learned to survive through adaptation, choosing themselves feels like betrayal. It feels wrong. It feels selfish. It feels dangerous. So instead of explaining, instead of negotiating, instead of reopening wounds that never healed the first time, they leave quietly, not because they do not care, but because caring has cost them more than they can afford anymore. Psychologically, this pattern often begins very early in life. Children who grow up in emotionally unpredictable environments develop what is known as hyperattunement. Their nervous system becomes calibrated to scan for shifts in mood, tone, and emotional temperature. They become experts at reading rooms before words are spoken. They learn when to speak, when to stay quiet, when to soften themselves, when to disappear. They learn how to adjust their personality to keep the peace, and this skill is often praised. They are called mature. They are called easy. They are called low maintenance. They are called independent. But what is really happening is that their nervous system is learning that safety comes from self-erasure, that their needs are secondary, that their feelings are negotiable, that their presence is conditional. So they grow into adults who are deeply empathetic, highly intuitive, emotionally intelligent, and quietly exhausted. They can love deeply, but they struggle to feel safe while doing so. They can form strong attachments, but they struggle to trust that those attachments will not cost them their identity. They want closeness, but their body remembers what closeness used to mean. It meant walking on eggshells. It meant being responsible for other people's emotions. It meant becoming smaller to keep others comfortable. It meant learning that love was something you earned through self-sacrifice. So when these people enter adult relationships, friendships, workplaces, and family systems, they often overfunction. They become the emotional regulator, the peacekeeper, the one who holds space, the one who listens, the one who understands, the one who forgives. They absorb more than they express. They adapt more than they ask. They compromise more than they are met. And for a long time, they tell themselves, this is what love looks like. Until one day, their body starts speaking louder than their beliefs. They feel heavy all the time. They feel tired in ways sleep does not fix. They feel irritated by small things. They feel disconnected from themselves. They feel like they are slowly disappearing. And this is where the psychology of disappearing begins. Because for someone whose boundaries were never respected early in life, setting boundaries later feels unnatural. It feels aggressive. It feels cruel. It feels like abandonment. So instead of negotiating space, instead of risking confrontation, instead of asking for more, they choose the only exit their nervous system recognizes as safe. They leave silently. They walk away without closure because closure would require opening emotional doors they spent their entire life learning how to keep shut. Closure would require naming pain that was never validated. Closure would require asking for understanding they learned not to expect. Closure would require trusting that their truth would be met with care instead of dismissal. And for someone whose early experiences taught them that vulnerability leads to harm, that is a risk their body simply cannot take. So they disappear. Not because they are heartless, but because they are protecting a nervous system that has been in survival mode for decades. What most people do not realize is that disappearing is not the absence of attachment. It is the presence of too much unprocessed attachment. It is what happens when someone has loved in silence for too long. It is what happens when someone has stayed loyal to people who were never loyal to their nervous system. It is what happens when someone finally realizes that they are allowed to choose themselves, but they do not yet know how to do it out loud. People who leave without closure often carry deep shame. Shame for needing space, shame for wanting more, shame for not being able to explain, shame for walking away. They often replay conversations in their head, imagining what they should have said, what they could have said, what they wish they had said. But in the moment, their body chose safety over explanation. And that choice is not weakness, it is adaptation. Their nervous system has learned that prolonged emotional conflict feels like danger. That unresolved tension feels like threat. That confrontation feels like abandonment. So the body goes into shutdown. And shutdown looks like distance, silence, withdrawal, disappearing. This is not manipulation. It is not punishment. It is not indifference. It is the final stage of emotional overwhelm. There is often a long period before the disappearance where these people tried in quiet ways to be seen. They hinted. They softened their needs. They minimized their pain. They tried to adjust themselves. They tried to be easier. They tried to be less. They hoped someone would notice. They hoped someone would meet them halfway. They hoped someone would say, "I see you carrying too much." But when that did not happen, their nervous system made a decision. If I stay, I disappear. so I must leave to survive. This is why their departure often feels sudden to others, because their struggle was internal, because their grief happened quietly, because their detachment began long before their absence. They mourned the relationship while still inside it. They let go slowly, one disappointment at a time, and by the time they leave, they have already cried all the tears they could cry. From the outside, it looks like abandonment. From the inside, it feels like relief mixed with heartbreak. They miss the connection, but they do not miss who they had to become to keep it. They do not miss silencing themselves. They do not miss the constant emotional labor. They do not miss shrinking, and yet they still grieve. Because walking away without closure does not mean the attachment disappears. It just means the attachment lives inside them instead of between them. This is why these people often struggle with guilt after leaving. They worry they were unfair. They worry they were cold. They worry they hurt someone who did not deserve it. But what they rarely acknowledge is how much they endured before they reached that breaking point. They are not people who leave easily. They are people who stay too long. They tolerate more than they should. They forgive more than is healthy. They compromise more than is sustainable until their body finally says no. And when the body says no, it does not negotiate. It exits. This pattern is especially common in people who grew up having to be the emotional adult in their family, the child who had to comfort their parent, the child who had to mediate conflict, the child who had to be strong, the child who learned that their needs created stress, the child who learned that being easy made them lovable. That child grows into an adult who is deeply compassionate, but also deeply depleted. And when that adult finally leaves, they often feel like they failed. When in reality, they finally listened to the part of themselves that had been asking for safety for a very long time. There is a grief that comes with disappearing, a grief for the version of the relationship they hoped it could become, a grief for the version of themselves they tried to hold together, a grief for the love that never quite felt safe. But there is also a quiet return, a return to their body, a return to their breath, a return to their boundaries, a return to themselves. And that return often begins in silence, because for the first time in their life, they are no longer performing, they are no longer adapting, they are no longer shrinking. They are finally resting, not because they stopped caring, but because they finally started caring for themselves. And that is something their nervous system has waited for their entire life. Most people who leave without closure do not do it on a whim. It is the culmination of a long internal unraveling that went unseen by the world. They carry an internal scorecard of emotional injuries, a ledger of moments where their needs were minimized, dismissed, or made to feel burdensome. And over time, that ledger grows. Not in dramatic scenes anyone else would notice, not in explosive confrontations, but in quiet withdrawals of energy, in moments of tension where they stepped back instead of engaging, in days when they felt tired before morning began, in a creeping sense of depletion that no amount of rest could erase. They carry relational fatigue in their nervous system long before they ever speak about it. This fatigue is not laziness. It is not detachment. It is the emotional weight of having given more than they were met with, and eventually that weight becomes unbearable. But they do not leave because they want to escape. They leave because they have already been in a state of quiet withdrawal long before the actual departure. Their involvement in the relationship slowly diminished, like light fading at dusk. They started to answer fewer calls. They smiled less. They stopped initiating connection. They became quieter. Their eyes looked near, but their attention began to drift inward, because part of them was already gone, long before their body finally exited. People who disappear without explanation often do so because they have been living inside emotional conflict for so long that conflict itself begins to feel like normal life. To someone watching from the outside, it may look like they walked away suddenly, but on the inside, they have already been unraveling. There is a hidden grief in this process that few observe. A grief for what once felt possible. A grief for the connection they once hoped would feel safe. A grief for repeating patterns they swore they would not repeat. A grief for parts of themselves they had to silence. Imagine carrying your own heartbreak quietly for years. Imagine tending to someone else's emotional needs while your own needs quietly wilted. Imagine learning that kindness is your role, not your choice. Imagine hoping that love would finally feel like safety, only to realize that safety was never how connection was modeled to you. This is the emotional terrain of someone who leaves without closure. There is a tenderness to their love that most people never see, because they give without showing their struggle. They adapt without complaining. They soothe without revealing pain. And when they finally stop doing these things, it does not mean they stop caring. It means they have run out of emotional currency. They have nothing left to give. And someone who learned early in life that rest was unsafe often pushes themselves until their system completely shuts down. This is not weakness. It is exhaustion disguised as absence. Many of these people carry a deep belief that no one will step in for them, not because no one ever cared, but because no one ever made them feel safe enough to rely on them. When someone repeatedly learns that help is unreliable, inconsistent, or absent altogether, their nervous system internalizes this pattern. They learn to depend on themselves. But self-reliance in this context is not confidence. It is survival. They learn to be their own emotional first responder, therapist, mediator, and safety net. This creates a paradox. They are people who give so much emotional capacity to others that their own capacity slowly disappears. But they never notice the disappearance because they have been taught to minimize their needs, to prioritize others, to appear resilient. And resilience, in this sense, becomes the language of emotional self-erasure. Resilience becomes what they are praised for, what others admire. But inside, resilience is a camouflage. It hides the parts of them that feel depleted, unseen, unprotected, and unheard. So when they finally reach the point of walking away, it does not feel like liberation at first. It feels like exhaustion. It feels heavy. It feels sad. It feels like mourning what they tried so hard to preserve because they did not want the connection to end. They wanted it to feel safe. They wanted it to feel reciprocal. They wanted it to feel like home. But what they experienced instead was a slow wearing down of their internal boundaries, without any recognition that those boundaries existed in the first place. This is why, for many of these people, leaving feels like failing. It feels like they gave up. It feels like they should have stayed longer. It feels like they should have fought harder. It feels like they should have explained more. But their body refuses to stay when staying feels like erasing themselves. There is a moment inside the internal process of leaving where someone feels two conflicting truths at the same time. They still love, and they also need distance. They still care, and they also feel unsafe. They still want connection, and they also know that remaining in the same dynamic will only further deplete them. These conflicting truths do not resolve with logic. They resolve with safety. That is why closure, for someone who never felt safe early in life, feels like danger. Closure would require exposing emotional wounds that were never healed. Closure would require vulnerability in a context where vulnerability was once met with dismissal. Closure would require trusting that their truth will be heard, and that trust is something their nervous system never learned. So instead of closure, they choose absence, because absence feels safer than vulnerability. Absence feels like protection, absence feels like control. And for someone who grew up without emotional protection, control is an internal contract with safety. So they leave, not because they are heartless, not because they are indifferent, not because they lack depth, but because their nervous system, after years of predicting relational threat, chooses survival over negotiation. There is a moment before they leave when they feel a strange blend of relief and grief. Relief because the constant tension is finally loosening. Grief because something meaningful is quietly dissolving. And this blend is the emotional architecture of their departure. It is not simple. It is not clear. It is not decisive and clean. It is chaotic, tender, and sorrowful all at once. It feels like losing oneself while trying to save oneself. It feels like mourning a relationship before it is gone. It feels like loving someone and also needing to walk away from them. This is why people who disappear without explanation are often misunderstood. They are misconstrued as cold, or unforgiving, or uncaring. But the truth is the opposite. They care deeply. They love intensely. They feel intensely. They just learned that expressing those needs was unsafe. And so they adapted. They internalized. They minimized. They self-soothed. They became resilient in all the ways that make them feel unseen. This internal resilience becomes a survival mechanism that eventually feels like isolation. And when isolation becomes familiar, leaving feels like the only way to reclaim themselves. Because inside their internal world, leaving feels like a return of agency, not as a dramatic declaration, not as a confrontation, but as a quiet exhale of a system that has been bracing itself for far too long. And so they walk away without explanation, without closure, without drama, but with deep internal complexity that no external narrative can capture. They do not vanish because they stopped caring. They vanish because staying meant losing themselves again. They vanish because connection without safety is still a form of danger. They vanish because their nervous system prefers distance over vulnerability that once felt like harm. And this is the psychology of people who disappear without closure. It is not simple. It is not neat. It is not easy to understand from the outside, but from the inside, it is an act of self-preservation. Not selfishness, not detachment, self-preservation. And self-preservation is not something you can explain in a moment. It is something you live for a lifetime. There is something deeply lonely about being the person who always understands. The one who senses when a room shifts. The one who knows when someone is pulling away before they admit it. The one who feels emotional distance before it has language. People who leave without closure are often people who have been alone inside relationships for a very long time. Not physically alone, emotionally alone. They learned how to sit beside someone while feeling unseen. They learned how to listen while never being asked how they were doing. They learned how to hold space while no one held space for them. And over time, that kind of loneliness does something quiet and devastating to the nervous system. It teaches the body that connection is unpredictable. It teaches the heart that love is conditional. It teaches the mind that safety must be created internally because it cannot be trusted externally. So these people become their own anchor. They learn how to regulate themselves. They learn how to self-soothe. They learn how to tolerate emotional discomfort without asking for support. And from the outside, they look strong. But on the inside, they are carrying a kind of solitude that few people ever notice. This is why they often struggle to explain why they are leaving. How do you put into words years of quiet disappointment? How do you summarize thousands of moments where you swallowed your truth? How do you describe a loneliness that existed inside a relationship? How do you explain that you were slowly disappearing while still being physically present? You cannot compress that experience into a conversation. And so instead of trying, they leave. Not because they do not respect the other person, but because they do not trust that their story will be understood. They have learned that explaining themselves often leads to being misunderstood. They have learned that asking for more often leads to being told they are asking for too much. They have learned that expressing hurt often leads to being told they are too sensitive. They have learned that their emotional reality is frequently minimized. So they stop trying to translate their inner world. They retreat into silence, and silence becomes their language. Silence becomes their boundary. Silence becomes their protection. When someone grows up in an environment where their emotions were dismissed or ignored, their nervous system learns a very specific lesson. It learns that emotional expression is dangerous, that vulnerability invites harm, that honesty creates conflict. So instead of learning how to repair relationships, they learn how to endure them. They learn how to tolerate emotional distance. They learn how to adapt to unmet needs. They learn how to survive in emotional scarcity. And when they finally reach a relationship where their unmet needs become too heavy to carry, they do not know how to negotiate. They only know how to leave. This is not because they are incapable of communication. It is because communication was never safe. They may be articulate, they may be thoughtful, they may be emotionally intelligent, but their body remembers what happened the last time they tried to express pain. So instead of reopening old wounds, they close the door and walk away. There's a moment in their leaving where they finally allow themselves to feel something they were not allowed to feel before. Anger. Not explosive anger, but quiet anger. Anger at being unseen. Anger at carrying too much. Anger at sacrificing themselves for love. Anger at always being the one who adjusts. This anger is not destructive. It is clarifying. It is the part of them that says, I deserved better. And when that voice finally becomes louder than the voice that says, stay, they leave. But because they are not practiced at expressing anger safely, they do not express it outwardly. They carry it inward. They translate it into distance. They transform it into absence. They turn it into silence. And silence becomes the final boundary. For many of these people, leaving is the first time they have ever chosen themselves. It is the first time they have prioritized their own nervous system. It is the first time they have honored their own limits. And that choice feels both empowering and terrifying, because they have spent their life believing that their worth comes from being needed. So choosing themselves feels like breaking a contract they never consciously signed. It feels like disobedience. It feels like betrayal. It feels like doing something wrong. This is why they often experience intense guilt after leaving, even when they know they made the right decision, even when their body finally feels calmer, even when their nervous system starts to settle. There is a part of them that feels like they failed, because they were taught that love means endurance. They were taught that loyalty means staying. They were taught that leaving is weakness. They were taught that sacrifice is virtue. So when they finally stop sacrificing themselves, they feel like they are doing something immoral. But in truth, they are doing something necessary. They are choosing safety. They are choosing rest. They are choosing themselves. And this choice is often the beginning of their healing. But healing for these people does not look dramatic. It looks quiet. It looks slow. It looks like learning how to sit in their own presence without performing. It looks like learning how to rest without guilt. It looks like learning how to listen to their body. It looks like learning how to recognize when something does not feel safe. It looks like learning how to trust their own boundaries. And perhaps most importantly, it looks like learning that love does not require self-abandonment, that connection does not require silence, that safety does not require distance. But this learning takes time. Because their nervous system has been shaped by years of emotional unpredictability, It has learned that closeness is risky. It has learned that dependency is dangerous. It has learned that vulnerability leads to pain. So even after they leave, their body may still brace for threat. They may still feel hypervigilant. They may still feel responsible for others. They may still feel guilty for choosing themselves. But slowly, as they sit in the quiet of their own life, something begins to change. They begin to notice what it feels like to not be on alert. They begin to notice what it feels like to wake up without dread. They begin to notice what it feels like to breathe fully. They begin to notice what it feels like to not manage someone else's emotions. They begin to notice what it feels like to exist without shrinking. And in that noticing, they begin to reconnect with parts of themselves they lost a long time ago. Parts that were silenced, parts that were neglected, parts that were never protected. Leaving without closure is not the end of their story. It is the beginning of their return. A return to their body, a return to their boundaries, a return to their intuition, a return to their truth. But it is also a process of grief. Grief for the love they wanted, grief for the connection they hoped for, grief for the safety they never had, grief for the self they had to abandon to survive. And this grief deserves tenderness. It deserves patience. It deserves compassion. Because people who leave without closure are not broken. They are adapted. They learned how to survive in environments where their needs were not prioritized. They learned how to protect themselves when no one else did. They learned how to endure emotional scarcity. And when they finally choose to leave, they are not running away. They are walking toward themselves. They are walking toward safety. They are walking toward rest. They are walking toward a life where love does not require disappearance. And that walk is not easy. It is quiet. It is lonely. It is brave in a way that few people recognize. Because it requires choosing yourself in a world that taught you to choose everyone else. And for someone who was never taught that their needs matter, that choice is the most radical form of self-respect. There is a moment after leaving that no one really talks about. It is the moment when the silence finally arrives. Not the silence of avoidance, not the silence of shutdown, but the quiet that comes after a long season of emotional noise. For people who walk away without closure, this silence feels unfamiliar at first. They are used to tension. They are used to monitoring. They are used to emotional labor. They are used to managing other people's feelings. So when that responsibility disappears, their nervous system does not immediately relax. It waits, it scans, it listens for danger. Because for most of their life, quiet was not safe. Quiet meant something was about to go wrong. Quiet meant conflict was brewing. Quiet meant someone was withdrawing. Quiet meant they needed to prepare. So even in freedom, their body still braces. They may feel restless. They may feel unsettled. They may feel like something is missing. But what is missing is not the relationship. What is missing is the familiar role they played inside it. The role of the caretaker, the stabilizer, the emotional anchor, the one who holds it all together. And when that role disappears, they are left with a question they have never been allowed to ask. Who am I when I am not managing someone else? For people who learned early in life that their value came from being useful, this question can feel disorienting. They were praised for being strong. They were praised for being responsible. They were praised for being mature. They were praised for not needing much. But they were rarely asked how they felt. They were rarely asked what they needed. They were rarely asked what made them feel safe. So when they finally step out of that role, they are left with a quiet emptiness that is not loneliness. It is unfamiliarity. They are meeting themselves for the first time, and that meeting can be both tender and painful because it brings awareness of how long they have been carrying too much, awareness of how often they ignored their own discomfort, awareness of how deeply they were conditioned to believe that love requires endurance. This awareness can feel like grief. Grief for the child who had to grow up too fast, grief for the teenager who learned to stay quiet, grief for the adult who stayed in situations that slowly drained them. But this grief is not something to rush. It is something to hold gently, because grief is not a sign that leaving was wrong. It is a sign that something mattered. It is a sign that there was real attachment. It is a sign that there was real hope. And grieving does not mean you should have stayed. It means you cared. People who leave without closure often struggle with the belief that they are somehow defective. They wonder why they could not just communicate better. They wonder why they could not just set boundaries. They wonder why they had to disappear. But this self-judgment ignores an important truth. You cannot use skills you were never taught. You cannot access safety that was never modeled. You cannot trust vulnerability when vulnerability once led to harm. Their way of leaving is not a failure of character. It is a reflection of the nervous system they developed. A nervous system shaped by unpredictability. A nervous system shaped by emotional inconsistency. A nervous system shaped by the absence of protection. So instead of asking why they could not stay and fix it, a more compassionate question is this: what did they need that they never received? What did they tolerate that slowly broke them down? What did they silence inside themselves to keep the peace? When these people begin to reflect with kindness instead of judgment, something shifts. They begin to see that their patterns were not flaws. They were adaptations. They were ways of staying safe in environments that did not feel safe. They were strategies for survival. And survival strategies do not disappear overnight. They soften slowly. They loosen as safety becomes consistent. They dissolve as trust is rebuilt. But trust, for someone who was never protected, must begin inside. It begins with listening to their body. It begins with honoring their discomfort. It begins with believing their own experience. It begins with allowing themselves to need. This is often the hardest part, because needing feels dangerous. Needing feels weak. Needing feels shameful. But in reality, needing is human. And the people who walk away without closure are often the ones who needed the most and received the least. They learned to be self-sufficient not because they wanted independence, but because dependence was not reliable. They learned to be strong not because they wanted power, but because vulnerability was not safe. They learned to be quiet not because they had nothing to say, but because speaking did not change anything. So when they finally allow themselves to need, it can feel like standing on unfamiliar ground. They may feel exposed, they may feel uncertain, they may feel afraid, but they may also feel something new: relief. Relief that they no longer have to carry everything alone. Relief that their emotions matter. Relief that they are allowed to take up space. Relief that they are allowed to rest. And rest, for these people, is revolutionary. Rest without guilt. Rest without apology. Rest without justification. Rest as a form of healing. Rest as a form of self-respect. Rest as a way of telling their nervous system, you are safe now. Healing does not mean they will never leave again. It means that if they leave, they will do so from clarity, not collapse. It means that if they stay, they will do so because it feels safe, not because they feel obligated. It means that if they speak, they will trust that their voice matters. It means that if they need space, they will not disappear. They will ask. And asking is not easy. Asking requires trust. Trust that their needs will be met. Trust that their feelings will be respected. Trust that they will not be punished for being honest. But trust grows slowly. It grows in safe relationships. It grows in consistent environments. It grows when their boundaries are honored. It grows when their emotions are taken seriously. It grows when they are allowed to be human. People who leave without closure are not incapable of healthy connection. They simply learned a different language of attachment, a language shaped by survival. But survival is not the same as living. And when they finally allow themselves to live, they begin to rewrite their internal story. They begin to learn that love can be calm, that connection can be steady, that safety can be real, that they do not have to disappear to be protected. They do not have to leave to be respected. They do not have to shrink to be loved. This learning does not happen all at once. It happens in small moments. Moments where they choose to speak instead of withdraw. Moments where they choose to stay present instead of shut down. Moments where they choose to trust instead of brace. And in those moments, something inside them softens. The part of them that has been holding their breath for years finally exhales. The part of them that has been waiting for safety finally rests. The part of them that learned to disappear finally feels seen. This is the quiet transformation of someone who once walked away without closure, not into someone who never leaves, but into someone who no longer has to vanish to survive. There is a moment in healing when something very quiet happens inside. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. It does not arrive with certainty or confidence. It arrives as a soft realization, a realization that says, maybe I was never broken. Maybe I was only surviving. For people who walked away without closure, this realization can feel like the first deep breath after years of holding their lungs tight, because for so long they believed there was something wrong with them, something wrong with how deeply they felt, something wrong with how easily they tired, something wrong with how much they needed, something wrong with how quickly they shut down. But when they begin to understand their own psychology, they begin to see that their nervous system was not defective. It was intelligent. It learned what it had to learn to survive. It adapted to environments that did not offer consistent safety. It created strategies that worked in moments where protection was missing, and those strategies kept them alive. But survival strategies are not meant to last forever. They are meant to carry someone through danger, and when danger becomes chronic, survival becomes identity. So part of healing is learning how to separate who they are from what they learned. They are not silence. They are not withdrawal. They are not disappearance. Those were responses. They were protection. They were the nervous system doing its best. But underneath those responses is a person who longs for connection, a person who longs to feel safe in closeness, a person who longs to be seen without performing, a person who longs to be loved without shrinking. And that longing was never wrong. It was simply waiting for the right conditions. When someone has lived most of their life in emotional survival mode, their body does not immediately trust peace. Even when peace arrives, they may feel uneasy. They may feel restless. They may feel suspicious of calm, because calm was never part of their early emotional language. They learned intensity. They learned unpredictability. They learned emotional labor. So calm feels unfamiliar. But unfamiliar does not mean unsafe. It means new. And new takes time. There is often a phase after leaving where they feel untethered. They no longer have a role to play. They are no longer responsible for someone else's stability. They are no longer needed in the way they once were. And that absence of responsibility can feel like emptiness. But emptiness is not loss. It is space. Space to meet themselves. Space to rest. Space to rebuild. Space to redefine what connection means. This is when self-forgiveness begins. Not the kind that erases the past, but the kind that softens it. The kind that says, I did what I knew how to do. The kind that says, I stayed because I hoped. The kind that says, I left because I needed to survive. The kind that says, I am allowed to choose myself. Self-forgiveness is not about justifying leaving. It is about understanding why leaving became necessary. It is about honoring the version of themselves that endured. It is about grieving the version of themselves that learned to disappear. It is about welcoming the version of themselves that is finally allowed to exist fully. For many people who leave without closure, the hardest person to forgive is themselves. They carry guilt for hurting others. They carry shame for not explaining. They carry regret for not trying one more time. But guilt does not mean they made the wrong choice. It means they have empathy. Shame does not mean they are flawed. It means they cared. Regret does not mean they should go back. It means the relationship mattered. And something can matter deeply and still not be safe. Something can be meaningful and still be harmful. Something can be loved and still need to be left. This is the paradox of attachment. It is not simple. It is layered. It is complex. It is emotional. And people who walk away without closure live inside that complexity long after they are gone. They replay memories. They revisit conversations. They question themselves. They wonder if things could have been different. But healing does not come from rewriting the past. It comes from understanding it. It comes from seeing patterns with compassion. It comes from honoring the truth of their experience. It comes from trusting the wisdom of their body. Their body knew when it was time. Their body knew when it could not carry anymore. Their body knew when it needed safety. And listening to that wisdom is not weakness. It is self-respect. There is a moment when someone who once disappeared realizes something powerful. They realize that they are allowed to take up space. They are allowed to have needs. They are allowed to ask for more. They are allowed to leave what hurts. They are allowed to choose peace. This realization is not loud. It is quiet. It settles into their bones. It changes how they move through the world. They begin to notice when something does not feel right. They begin to honor their discomfort. They begin to trust their intuition. They begin to speak sooner. They begin to leave earlier. They begin to protect themselves gently, not through disappearance, but through presence, through boundaries, through truth. And this is the shift from vanishing to existing, from surviving to living, from silence to self-expression, from endurance to choice. This does not mean they will never feel the urge to withdraw again. Withdrawal was once safety. So when stress rises, their nervous system may still reach for distance. But now they have awareness. They can pause. They can breathe. They can ask themselves, what do I need right now? They can choose connection when it feels safe. They can choose space when it feels necessary. They can choose themselves without disappearing. And that is healing. Healing is not becoming someone new. It is becoming who they were before they had to adapt. It is remembering the parts of themselves that were silenced. It is reclaiming the parts of themselves that were neglected. It is protecting the parts of themselves that were never protected. And when they finally do this, something remarkable happens. They begin to feel safe inside themselves. They become their own home. They become their own anchor. They become their own protection. And from that place, connection becomes possible again. Not connection built on self-sacrifice. Not connection built on endurance, but connection built on mutual care, on reciprocity, on safety, on presence, on choice. This is the quiet ending of the story of someone who once left without closure, not as someone who runs, but as someone who stays with themselves, not as someone who disappears, but as someone who finally exists fully, not as someone who is broken, but as someone who survived and now chooses to live